When I was a junior in high school, I was afraid there was something wrong with me. I was having a hard time paying attention in school, in my classes, and especially when the teacher was writing something on the chalkboard. It was really hard to pay attention, and I found my mind wandering constantly, and I also knew that I was starting to get headaches in the middle of the day, which had never happened before. And so I remember thinking, there was a friend next to me. I'm just going to say something. I said, I just wish the teacher would write a little bigger and press on the chalk a little harder. And my friend that's sitting next to me said, well, I can see perfectly. Do you think maybe, Alan, you need to get your eyes checked? And of course, my first reaction was, there's nothing wrong with me. I can see perfectly. It's the teacher's fault. It's everybody's fault but mine. And finally, I thought, just in case my friend's right, I better go to the eye doctor and just see if maybe something's wrong with my eyes. To make a long story short, a few weeks later, I was wearing my very first pair of prescription glasses, and I felt like I was looking at the world for the first time clearly. It was amazing, I remember at that time, how when I would look at trees in the distance, I could actually see the individual leaves on the trees and on the branches. Before, it was just kind of this green melding together type of thing. And I was just amazed at how trees actually did have leaves. And then I would look at a flower at a distance, and I could see it so clearly. And I thought, all this time, I thought there was something wrong outside of me. It had nothing to do with me, I thought. But as I learned that it was actually my vision, I started thinking, there's a lot of things in life that are kind of like that. Not just physical vision, but intellectually speaking and spiritually speaking as well. There are things that we just don't see, and we think the problem is outside of ourselves. And as I was looking at today's gospel lesson that Larry read, probably the longest gospel lesson that's been read from this pulpit in the church's history. Thank you, Larry. Didn't mean to pick on you this morning. But anyway, as I was thinking about that lesson, I thought, that's really what Jesus is talking about, isn't it? So there's this literal blind man. So Jesus, I think, is having some fun with both the literalness of it all as well as what's really happening inside more figuratively. But you've got this blind man that clearly cannot see anything and has never been able to. But the whole point of the story really seems to be about the Pharisees, the religious and political leaders of the day that thought that they could see things intellectually and spiritually, that Jesus was basically saying, you are the blind ones. And so here's a blind man that can actually pretty soon see very clearly, and yet the religious leaders and the political leaders, that's who the Pharisees were, they basically thought they could see everything clearly, but they saw it all wrong. So as I was thinking about the times in my life when I thought I could see something really clearly, and then somehow something switched, and I can't really describe or explain it, but all of a sudden, that feeling where all of a sudden you see things, and you go, oh, I get it now. It's like, now I can see it. That's really what Jesus is talking about in John chapter 9 here, okay? So you've got this blind man, and it's really interesting to me how the disciples are the ones that bring up this idea of sin. And they say, well, Jesus, who sinned that this man is blind? Was it him or his parents? And Jesus is probably rolling his eyes once again at the disciples, explaining to them, this isn't about sin at all. But you know what? I think that we all have a tendency to do that in one way or another, at least at times in our lives, when we think, what have I done wrong to cause this bad thing to happen? Or maybe even going so far as to saying, God, why me? Why are you doing this to me? And obviously, this man has never been able to see a thing his entire life, and that's the conclusion that the disciples jump to. Who did something wrong for this to happen? And Jesus' response is, first of all, nobody sinned, not this man or his parents. Basically, it's just what it is. But then Jesus goes on to say, this man was born blind so that the works of God might be revealed in him. In other words, this man is here on the earth who happens to be blind because God is doing something in his life that others might see God more clearly. And it made me think, as I was reading this, isn't that why we're all here? Isn't that why you're here? God put you on this earth so that other people can look at you and say, I understand God a little better because of you. Now, that word works, that I just mentioned, when Jesus said, this man was born blind so that the works of God might be revealed through him or in him. The word works comes from the Greek word ergon. And that word not only means work, but it also means action. It means a task. It means a whole bunch of other things, but it also means handiwork or workmanship. And I was wondering as I was reading that this week and reading the Greek, I wonder if Jesus was really alluding to the fact here that we are God's handiwork. We are God's workmanship. God has done something really special for each of us to be exactly who we are in this world. This man was not born blind because of his parents' sin or his own sin, Jesus said, but so that the works or workmanship or handiwork of God might be revealed in him. Now, to me, when I read it in that context, it changes the meaning. It's just not that God's doing a work, whatever that means out there, but God is doing something within us, because we are God's handiwork, and God is continuing the work of handiworking. I know that's not probably a word, but anyway, that's what Jesus is getting at here. That's what it's all about. It's interesting that the disciples seem to be okay with that. There's no response to Jesus saying he's wrong, but the response comes then from the Pharisees. And it makes me realize that, and I've thought about this several times before, that sometimes when you're doing something to help yourself see clearly or helping somebody else see clearly, there's people out there that don't like it. There's people out there that resist it. And it's often the people in power, the people who don't want to change things, that they kind of like things the way they are. They kind of like people being very blind, actually. But it's the Pharisees that rejected the fact that the man was even born blind in the first place. They thought it was impossible. Went to his parents and say, tell us that this man wasn't really born blind. And they said, well, we're his parents. He was born blind. So then they basically talk to the blind man again, or the formerly blind man, and they're trying to get him to admit something about Jesus so they can either kick him out of the synagogue or else say, see, this man said that Jesus didn't do it. It was some other reason. It had nothing to do with Jesus. But the Pharisees were so intent on making Jesus wrong that they called Jesus a sinner. There's that word again. So Jesus is the sinner, and the man basically says, I don't know if Jesus is a sinner or not. All I know is I once was blind, and now I see. And then he goes on to say something about he must have been doing something from God. And that's what did it for the Pharisees. They told the man not only he was a sinner, but he was born entirely in sin. In other words, the religious and political leaders of the day, when you disagreed with them, or when you saw things differently from how they saw things, their only conclusion was that you were a sinner. Everything's wrong with you. There's no room for discussion. We're right, you're wrong. We're kicking you out of the synagogue because we don't want wrong people around us, people who disagree with us. Now, as we think about the beatitude that Larry read for us this morning, blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. The works of God are to show mercy. In other words, God has shown mercy to us simply by giving us life. God continues to show mercy to us day after day by giving us breath, by giving us all the blessings in our lives. And our role is to show those other people in the world and in our lives that same kind of mercy. That's what it means to open your eyes to Jesus. So as I was thinking about how individually we can all do that, we can decide, we can choose how we're going to see. In other words, we can choose to see like the Pharisees, that we're the only ones that have the right to clear vision, and everybody that disagrees with us is wrong and born in sin, if we want to go that far. We can choose to see the whole world like that, or we can choose to see the world through the eyes of Jesus, where Jesus says, "Blessed are the merciful." And Jesus constantly showed acts of mercy. Even in this story, his act of mercy was to give the blind man his vision. So we can choose to not see more clearly or to see things in the way that the people that don't ever want to change and don't like it when people disagree with them, or we can decide, you know what, I might disagree with you. That's okay. What can I learn from you? How can I still be merciful to you? And as I listen to the news and read the newspaper, we don't see a lot of that in our society that's talked about, do we? It's almost just, well, it's not almost, it's just the opposite. We're right, you're wrong. No, we're right, you're wrong. And it just keeps going back and forth and back and forth. And yet Jesus calls us to open our eyes and look at the people that we disagree with and say, what can we learn from you through the eyes of mercy, through the eyes of compassion, and through the eyes of kindness? Now, as I was thinking about individually how we get to choose, I also started thinking, well, what does this mean for a church like ours? What does it mean for our community? I might even go so far as to say, what does this mean for our nation? Because I have a feeling that we can all learn to see better as a community or as a group if we want to. So there's a lady who is a wonderful writer. Her name is Marilyn Chandler McIntyre. And she actually used to teach at Westmont College in Santa Barbara, where I attended. And now I believe she's teaching at UC Berkeley. And she's just one of those people, every time I read something that she's written, I think, I want to hear this person speak in public sometime, because she is one of those people that just helps people to open their eyes. And here's a quote that I came across that I actually read years ago about how a community can do that. And she writes, "When a community makes a collective decision to recognize and fosters one another's gifts, the term itself becomes a lens." In other words, like eyeglasses that you look through. Suddenly, the human landscape around us is transformed by the intention of seeing others as gift bearers and as gifts. In other words, when we're a community and someone disagrees with us, rather than just immediately saying, "But I'm right and you're wrong," we can say, "How can I see you as a gift to me?" We might be on totally opposite ends of the theological or political spectrum or whatever, but how can I see you and your presence as a gift to me, even though I might completely disagree with your stance? How can I do that? And not only how can I see you as a gift, but what gifts might I be able to see you bringing to me? That's what makes us a church. We come together not because we're all the same and agree on everything all the time. We come together because we're willing to see each other not only as gifts, but as gift bearers. And I want to say, even when we disagree, but maybe I should say, especially when we disagree. I also was reading something recently from Dr. Richard Mao. He was actually the president of Fuller Theological Seminary, where I attended, and he was, several years ago, writing a little essay about vision, and he quoted the ancient Christian mystics. And it was just a very simple term in Latin that goes like this: ubi amor ibi oculus. And the rough translation is, where there is love, there is vision. And in his essay, he was talking about how through the ages, and especially with the ancient Christian mystics, but through the ages, we Christians have learned to see more clearly through the lenses of compassion and kindness. Where there is love, there is vision. We see clearly, in other words, like God sees, when we're willing to see everybody else and everything else through the eyes of God, which are the lenses of love. And then Richard Mao goes on to quote the Protestant reformer, theologian John Calvin, that talks about how the scriptures are our lenses that we look through together in order to see more clearly. In other words, what he's saying is we read the scriptures together, like we do on Sunday mornings. We hear them together. We talk about them together. And because we do that, we see more clearly. We see what our options are in terms of seeing that we may not even have seen as options before. Now, I wasn't around during the days of John Calvin, but I think he has a really good point. We can see more clearly through those lenses of compassion. And so I challenge you, when you see somebody or listen to somebody or hear about something that you just disagree with, rather than immediately thinking, but I'm right and you're wrong, I invite you to take a deep breath and then just say, how can this person be a gift to me? What gift might this person bring to me? And how can I see this person through the lenses of love as God sees them? Imagine if the entire world actually operated like that, how much better off we would be. And as I think about the Christian church and our call as a community of faith to be like this, I think this is the same call to vision as every single religion out there should have, whether it's Christian or Jewish or Muslim or Buddhist or Hindu or even agnostic or atheist. It's like if we would agree to see each other and see the world through the lenses of love, I'm convinced that there would be no more wars. I'm convinced that most of the problems that we have in the world would disappear overnight. So what do we do as a congregation? Again, it's our choice. Just like the individual has a choice to see better, we as a congregation have a choice to see each other and to see everything and everyone out there through the lenses of compassion rather than judgment. And Jesus made it really clear when he said, I came into this world so that the blind may see. I hope that we as a congregation would be at least willing to admit that we don't always see clearly like God does all the time. If we did, we probably wouldn't need church. In fact, that's one reason I'm here, because you help me see more clearly. And I think we all help each other see more clearly when we see through the lenses of love, and like John Calvin said, when we look at the scriptures together, saying, how can we see the world, including our own lives, but how can we see the world as God sees the world? Through the eyes of mercy, compassion, grace, and kindness. Amen.